Welcome to task list D. D-01, use positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is when you add something to increase. So positive always will mean that you're adding a stimulus, and reinforcement means that the future occurrence of the behavior will increase. Negative reinforcement, negative means that you're removing something, and then reinforcement again is something that's going to make the future frequency of the behavior increase. So looking over positive reinforcement, for example, a baby increased hitting the mobile with his hands because it made a pretty sound the baby liked. This in the future will, of course, potentially increase the baby's hitting of the mobile. If you ever have had a baby, you would know that sometimes when they do something that's interesting to themselves, it increases their likelihood of their behavior continuing in that direction. Then another example would be, the teacher praised the student for passing in her homework on time. More likely to pass it in on time in the future. Praise is always a good reinforcer to use. It can be generalized to the public settings that these individuals we work with are within every day. So positive reinforcement is going to increase the future frequency of the behavior by adding a stimulus or some form of reinforcement verbally. Negative reinforcement. Now, negative reinforcement is when you remove something that increases the likelihood of that individual's behavior in the future. So, for example, Heather takes an aspirin and her headache stops. A lot of individuals think that taking the aspirin is adding into the environment. However, what is that aspirin doing? It's removing her headache. So in the future, she's more likely to take an aspirin to remove her headache, the adversive stimulus. And then you have the teacher removed the student from the classroom when he was yelling. So when the teacher removed the student from the classroom for yelling, the teacher is more likely to remove the individual from the classroom in the future if they consistently yell. So removing a stimulus to decrease the future frequency of the behavior. Negative is always going to be removing something aversive when it's paired with reinforcement. And reinforcement is always going to increase the future frequency of the behavior. D-2, use appropriate parameters of schedules of reinforcement. So within this, we have continuous reinforcement. And continuous reinforcement is when you continually reinforce each occurrence of a behavior. So every single occurrence of that behavior you're going to reinforce because it's continuous. For example, a teacher using a continuous schedule of reinforcement would praise a student each time she identified a sight word correctly. Then you have, however, intermittent schedules of reinforcement. And this is not every instance is going to be reinforced. So this is contingency of reinforcement in which some, but not all, occurrences of the behavior produce reinforcement. So fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, variable interval, those are going to be your intermittent schedules of reinforcement. And then, of course, you have extinction. And this is a behavior that has been previously reinforced, usually paired with differential reinforcement. So what's the difference between fixed versus variable? Well, fixed ratio is a fixed amount of responses. So every time they get something right and they respond correctly, you're going to give them praise or you're going to give them an edible. It's going to be every single time. Then you have fixed interval, and this is going to be a fixed amount of time instead of responses. So every 3 minutes, based on their response, if it's correct, you're going to give them praise or an edible or a tangible every 3 minutes, okay? Then you have variable ratio. Variable ratio is on average. It's the average amount of responses. So it could be a VR2, a VR4, a VR6, but you're going to have that middleman. So you're going to have that VR4, and on average, you're going to reinforce the individual every 4 responses. However, it's on average. So you could reinforce them every 3 responses, every 5 responses. It's intermittent, okay? Then you have variable interval, similar to variable ratio, just that it's an average amount of time. So on average, every 3 minutes, the individual was reinforced for a correct response, but they could have been reinforced after 2 minutes or 4 minutes. It's just a variable amount of time. D-03. Use prompts and prompt fading. Stimulus prompt. This acts on the antecedent stimuli, not on the response, and it involves movement, position, and redundancy. We'll get further into these. Then we have response prompts. These act on the response itself, not on antecedent stimuli. So modeling, verbal instruction, physical guidance. So what's the difference between stimulus versus response? Stimulus. They call attention to the stimulus that is in need of help. So this involves movement, such as touching or pointing to or tapping on. Position, place it closer to the individual. Redundancy, the dimensions of the stimulus are paired with the correct response. So it could be bigger, bolder, larger, brighter. And then you have response prompt. This is verbal. It could be vocal or non-vocal, so it could be in writing too. A sticky note on the door saying, "Take the trash out." That's a response prompt. Then you have modeling. You're showing the individual what they should do. We use this in BTS training or BST training, behavior skills training with our individuals. Competency-based training. We use this modeling to show everyone what we should do in the field. And then we have physical prompting. This is guiding the individual's hand or body in a direction that it is supposed to move to obtain a correct response. Here's a little visual for you guys. Another visual, you can find all free visuals at rogue.com. D-04, use modeling and imitation training. So some individuals that we work with are going to need to learn imitation skills. The goal is to teach individuals to do what the model does. So what we're doing with our individual, they're supposed to imitate. So it's any physical movement that may function as a model for imitation. A model is an antecedent stimulus that evokes the imitative behavior. An imitative behavior must immediately follow the presentation of the model within 3 to 5 seconds in order for it to be considered imitation. The model and the behavior must have formal similarity. Okay, so remember with formal similarity, we're talking about it must be both vocal or both the same movements. Okay, so it has to look the same. And then the model must be the controlling variable for an imitative behavior. So you are the individual who's controlling the other one's behavior of copying or imitating you. 5 steps of imitation training. You should assess and teach any prerequisite skills for imitation training because you need to know if they're able to sit there and attend and look at you. You should select models for training, so individuals who are going to work on the team. You're going to utilize a pre-test, meaning you're going to see what the individual already has in their repertoire. And then sequence models for training. Now you're going to train individuals on how to model and how to get the individual to imitate. And then you're going to fully implement imitation training. D-05, use shaping. This is a process involving systematically and differentially reinforcing successive approximations to a terminal behavior. So what does that mean? Well, in essence, it means you're teaching them steps to get to an end goal. Okay, so an end behavior. So the end product of shaping, a terminal behavior, can be claimed when the topography, frequency, latency, duration, or amplitude of the target behavior reaches a predetermined criterion level. So you could potentially use shaping with a changing criterion design because you are shaping the behavior to reach a certain criterion. That way, once they reach that criterion, you're moving on to the next level of that criterion until they reach the end behavior. For instance, it could be driving a car. You're teaching somebody to drive a car. You're going to teach them in slow steps what to do. Get in the car. Turn on the car. Put your foot on the brake. Put your foot on the gas. Roll down the window. You're teaching them how to use a car, how to drive a car, what to do, look at your mirrors, all these different steps. They're not going to be little tiny steps like a task analysis, which we'll get to, but they're going to be steps that shape the actual behavior of driving a car, with the end behavior of being the most reinforced. With shaping, you're not only reinforcing the first behavior, so say they get in the car and they turn it on. You're going to reinforce that. Now you're not going to reinforce that behavior the second time. Now you're going to have them turn on the car and put their foot on the brake. Then you're going to reinforce. Then you're going to have them turn on the car, put their foot on the brake, put the control in reverse. And now you're going to reinforce them. So each step is aiming toward a terminal behavior of driving that car. But not each step is now going to get reinforced, just the next final step. So successive approximations is getting to that next step. You're taking little steps to get there, but not so little like a task analysis. Differential reinforcement is part of shaping. We will get to differential reinforcement at the end of task list D, but it is part of shaping in the fact that it's a procedure in which reinforcement is provided for responses that share a predetermined dimension or quality, and in which reinforcement is withheld for responses that do not demonstrate that equally. Shaping, again explained, is a procedure used to establish a behavior that is not presently performed by an individual. So when you're shaping, you're typically teaching them new or novel behaviors. The method used is differential reinforcement of successive approximations, which was introduced by our home guy, B.F. Skinner. Shaping assists in discrimination, which is the ability to tell the difference between stimuli that are and are not reinforced, and in generalization, which is the application of a response learned in one situation to a different but similar situation. So again, definition of shaping is development of a new behavior by successive reinforcement of closer approximations and extinguishing of preceding approximations of behavior. There are 5 aspects of behavior that can be shaped. So we have the topography, frequency, period of time, duration, latency, intensity. You cannot use shaping for a changing criterion design. In other words, a changing criterion design you use for individuals that have the behavior already in their repertoire. Shaping is a novel behavior. It's something new you're teaching them, so you cannot use it with a changing criterion design. However, it has been noted in Cooper that a changing criterion design can be used with shaping of the dimension. So with dimensions, we're typically going toward a closer approximation, right? Or building up toward. That's what we're doing in a changing criterion design. We are building up toward a certain type of criterion. So they need to aim for 5 responses. They need to aim for 10 responses. They need to aim for 15 responses. That is shaping a dimension. Okay? D-06, use chaining. So this is when it increases the independent living skills so that individuals can function more independently in society. It's a specific sequence of discrete responses, each associated with a particular stimulus condition. So chaining does have benefits. It increases an individual's current behavioral repertoire. For instance, teaching a person with intellectual disabilities the steps of working in an assembly line for employment. Chaining is part of a treatment package. The steps in chaining consist of the purpose. So why are we using chaining? What's the reason? Assessing baseline level of mastered steps. Does the individual already have steps within that they know how to do? And do we necessarily need to teach those or not? And then deciding on a behavior chaining method, which leads us to D07. Conduct task analysis. So this is required to implement the chaining procedure. It involves breaking a complex skill into smaller, teachable units, the product of which is a series of sequentially ordered steps or tasks. It's individualized, and there are two types of methods. There's the single opportunity method and multiple opportunity method. So what's the difference between single versus multiple? So single just means that you're conducting a task analysis and you're assessing the individual's ability to complete certain tasks. If, however, they are unable to complete a step in the task analysis and you write a minus, you are no longer going to have them complete the rest of the task. You are going to do it yourself. And then you have multiple, and this is where you're evaluating again and assessing the individual's ability to complete the task analysis. You're going to have them do every single step, even if they get a minus, and it's going to see where they're at and what they are able to do and what you need to teach. Single opportunity is not as useful as multiple. Single is very brief and it saves time. However, multiple is going to be more intense and it's going to show you what is in the individual's repertoire, what they already know how to do, what you need to teach them, and it's going to help you choose which task analysis you need to use. So we do have multiple types of task analysis. The first is forward chaining. This is when you teach the behavior or the task in order. So you're going to start with the first task list item. You're going to teach it to the individual, and once they master that item, then you're going to move on to the second one. So now they're going to do steps 1 and 2. They're going to master steps 1 and 2, and then you move on to the third step. So you're going in order. Backward chaining is a little different. We use backward chaining with individuals who potentially or not necessarily could wait for reinforcement, but they have trouble waiting for reinforcement. So we're going to do backward chaining so they can obtain reinforcement more quickly, which is the basically end behavior of the chain, the last step. So for instance, if we're teaching somebody to cook a recipe, you, the behavior therapist or the behavior analyst, are going to teach the entire, you're going to do the entire task except for the last step. Then the individual is going to do the last step, which is, say, taking the food out of the oven. That's going to be the last step. It brings them to that reinforcement of, oh, now I get to eat my food. Then there's, besides forward chaining and backward chaining, we have total task, and this is where you teach the entire task to the individual all together so that they can learn the entire task. There is a variation of backward chaining. This is backward chaining with leaps ahead. This just means when you did the assessment and chaining that you realized that in your multiple opportunity that this individual has some behaviors in the repertoire. Great, that's awesome. So now you're going to teach them steps 1 through 3, but they know how to do steps 4 through 6, and then you need to teach them 7 through 9, and they do step 10 by themselves because it's backward chaining. Okay, but these are steps that are already in their individual's repertoire that they already know how to do, so you don't need to teach those specific steps. D-08 use discrete trial and free operant arrangement. So discrete trial training is controlled by a given opportunity to emit the response. Okay, so it typically has responses. You're sitting at a desk, conducting a trial, and they get reinforcement following that trial. Free operant arrangement is it's in the environment. It's everyday situations that are going on, and you're teaching them based on that. So it's systematic instructional routines that are in the environment. So discrete trials consist of 5 components: the SD, the prompt or response, reinforcement, and inter-trial interval. Free operant arrangements again. This is an operant behavior that results in minimal displacement of the participant in time and space. It allows the client to respond based on their own schedule and initiation, as opposed to discrete trial training, where responding is controlled by the presentation of stimuli from the behavior tech or the BCBA. D-09 use verbal operants as a basis for language assessment. So now we're getting into language. We're getting into verbal behavior. And this was created by Skinner. As you can see, Skinner has created a lot of stuff for us to acknowledge and utilize. And so verbal language, and verbal operants are basically a behavior that is reinforced through the mediation of another person's behavior. So you have the speaker and you have the listener. The speaker is always going to be reinforced by the listener's behavior. It involves communication that helps individuals get what they desire and avoid what is undesirable to them. It's defined by the function of the response, not the topography. So not what it looks like, it's based on what the individual does. Our first verbal behavior that we're going to talk about is echoic training. So this is a type of verbal operant that occurs when the speaker repeat the verbal behavior of another speaker. So if I said echo and you said echo, that is echoic training right there. You've repeated what I've said. With echoic training, there is formal similarity, so they're both going to be verbal. And then there is point to point, where they both have the same beginning, middle, and end. Then we have man training. This is the first thing that you teach an individual. It is a type of verbal operant in which the speaker asks for or states or demands and implies what he or she wants or needs. So it's saying, hey, I need water, and the listener is going to go get you water if it has a specific reinforcer involved in it. And there's also going to be an MO, a motivating operation. Your want, your value, your need in getting water. D-12, tact training. The tact is a type of verbal operant in which the speaker names things and actions that the speaker has direct contact with. There are any in the sense mode, so seeing, smelling, hearing, touching, all those different types of sense modes can be utilized within tact training. Tact training typically starts off with verbal stimuli. However, it does develop into nonverbal stimuli down the road so that individuals can tact items once they are taught what they are. Then we have interverbal training, D-13. This is a verbal operant in which the speaker differentially responds to other persons. So it typically has conversations or fill in the blanks, such as twinkle, twinkle, and then they say little star, and it ends with a conditioned reinforcer, so generalized conditioned reinforcer saying good job. Interverbal training does not have point-to-point or formal similarity. Then we have D-14. So we spoke a little bit about the listener, going more in depth into listener training. It's less significant than typically assumed because much of what is often described as listener behavior, thinking, or understanding is more correctly classified as speaker behavior. So for example, you say, Jane, clap your hand. Jane is going to clap their hands. That is the listener responding to the speaker. You say, hey, pass the salt. They pass the salt, you say thank you. That is listener training. Listener training, the behavior is typically non-verbal. Whereas tact training and man training, those are going to be verbal responses. On to the rest of task list D. D-15, identify punishers. Just like we identify reinforcers with preference assessments and reinforcers assessments, we're going to utilize that to also identify punishers, something that's aversive in the environment for the individual, something the individual does not necessarily like, we're going to use. There's a reason why we have the three principles: reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. We need to know what is punishing to an individual in order to punish them. D-16, use positive and negative punishment. As we spoke about with positive and negative reinforcement prior, positive is always going to be that you added something into the environment. However, punishment now is going to decrease the future frequency of that behavior. Negative, you're removing something aversive from the environment with reinforcement. However, with punishment, negative, you're removing something the individual likes, so that you decrease the future frequency of their behavior. So there are types of negative punishment. We have response cost, which is the removal of a token. So you're removing a token whenever a behavior, an inappropriate behavior occurs. And then we have timeout procedures. We have non-exclusionary and exclusionary. We prefer to stick with non-exclusionary in our real-world events. However, for exam purposes, for Cooper purposes, we have to explain both scenarios. So for non-exclusionary, we have planned ignoring. This is exactly what we do with extinction. We're just ignoring the individual's behavior. And then we have contingent observation. This is when the individual is in the classroom. They're able to see what's going on. They're just not allowed to participate and receive reinforcement. And then we have the timeout ribbon. An individual is going to be wearing a ribbon. This means that they can receive reinforcement. So remember, wearing ribbon equals reinforcement. If they're not receiving or wearing a ribbon, they're not receiving reinforcement. So you're going to withdraw of positive reinforcers for all of these. Then you have exclusionary, and this is you have the timeout room when you put somebody in a room by themselves. Then you have partition timeout, where you block the individual from seeing what's going on. And then you have a hallway timeout, and this typically occurs in schools, where you put them in the hallway when they're having inappropriate behavior. D-17, use appropriate parameters and schedules of reinforcement. This is the exact same thing again as schedules of reinforcement. You're going to do it the exact same way, utilize it the exact same way. Punishers on a FR3 schedule, punishers on an FI2 schedule, you're going to put them on the same type of schedule you would as reinforcement so that you decrease their likelihood of continuing that inappropriate behavior. D-18, use extinction. This is a procedure that occurs when a previously reinforced response is discontinued, so that behavior decreases in the future and eventually it doesn't exist. So you're going to withhold any reinforcement in that environment that goes toward increasing the inappropriate behavior. However, with extinction, we're going to get into that you're going to want to pair it with reinforcement in some way. Remember, extinction is not a punishment procedure. So then we get to D-19, where we talk about combinations of reinforcement with punishment and extinction. In our ethical code, which I hope you guys are reading, our ethical handbook states that we must always pair punishment and extinction with some form of reinforcement, otherwise it's considered unethical. So make sure that you're always pairing the two together, either reinforcement and punishment or reinforcement and extinction. And that leads us to D-20, and we'll discuss why extinction and punishment are paired with reinforcement when we get to D-21. So D-20, this is use response independent time-based schedules of reinforcement, basically non-contingent reinforcement, NCR. So NCR is a response independent time-based schedule of reinforcement. What does that mean? So it means, in other words, the behavior can still occur and you're still going to offer reinforcement in that environment whether or not the behavior occurs or not. You're just going to offer reinforcement around that behavior so that the NCR, when you establish it, it becomes an abolishing operation. The inappropriate behavior is no longer valuable to the individual. So you're going to reinforce them before the behavior, after the behavior, for something other than the behavior. And you're going to continually do this on a time-based schedule, whether or not the behavior is occurring or not. With this, there are, of course, cons compared to the pros. One con would be that you reinforce a different inappropriate behavior, but one that's not technically being utilized as the one for reduction. For instance, nose picking or tapping a pencil on the table when you're trying to reduce yelling out in the classroom. So here's a nice visual brought to you again by Rogue. They have great visuals for free. Go download them. This is NCR broken down a little bit more. And lastly, we have D-21, use differential reinforcement, which we already heard about with shaping, but now we're going to get more in depth to it of why we use it with punishment and extinction and reinforcement combined. So first up, we have DRA. DRA is differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. What does that mean? So basically, you're going to reinforce an alternative behavior. You're going to match that behavior's function with an alternative, more appropriate response. So if you're teaching an individual to not yell out in class, you're going to use FCT and you're going to teach them how to speak appropriately in the classroom. That's an alternative, a more appropriate behavior. You're using FCT while placing yelling on extinction. You see how we're utilizing reinforcement, implementing an appropriate behavior, all while using extinction. Then we have DRI. DRI is differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. This means that two behaviors cannot be done together simultaneously. So if the individual likes to hit things such as the desk or the locker, you're going to teach them how to keep those hands busy, either in their pocket or holding onto a stress ball of some sort. They can't do both things at once. If their hands are in their pocket, they can't be punching a locker. Then we have DRO, and this is differential reinforcement of other behaviors. So this is basically you're reinforcing any other behavior but the behavior you're trying to decrease. Okay, so for instance, if the behavior occurs every 4 minutes, you're going to reinforce them for any behavior other that's occurring at 3.5 minutes. Even if it's potentially inappropriate, you're going to reinforce them because you're looking to identify that behavior you're looking to decrease. So the behavior that you already identified as inappropriate, you're looking to decrease that behavior, and potentially later on you may have to decrease another behavior that you accidentally reinforced. But we're hoping in the long run with DRO, we're reinforcing something other than the inappropriate behavior so that they're less likely to do that inappropriate behavior and more likely to, based on reinforcement, do the appropriate behavior. Then we have DRL, and this is typically paired with IRT, enter response time, that we spoke about in section A. So DRL, differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior. This is when you're trying to decrease a high rate behavior. So we're going to use IRT with this. If you are increasing the time between responses, you are decreasing the behavior from occurring. If you are decreasing the time between responses, you are increasing the behavior to occur. For example, time between bites. If the individual eats really fast, we're going to increase IRT in between those bites. So the time between those bites, all while decreasing the behavior of them eating really fast. If the individual, for instance, eats really slow and they only have a 20-minute lunch period, you're going to decrease the amount of time between bites while increasing the individual's behavior. Last, or second to last, we have DRH, differential reinforcement of high rate behaviors. This is when you have a low rate behavior that you're trying to increase now. So a typical example would be you have a student in a classroom who is not raising their hand enough or participating enough in the classroom. You're going to give them reinforcement every single time they participate, and you're going to give them the most reinforcement, the most highest magnitude of reinforcement so that they continue to want to participate. So you're increasing appropriate behavior. And lastly, we have DRD, differential reinforcement of diminishing rates. Okay? So now we are diminishing rates of behavior. So we're decreasing the rate of behavior, decreasing the time or the amount of the behavior. A typical example that individuals use is smoking. So, for instance, if you smoke 25 cigarettes in a 30-minute period, you're going to decrease your behavior to 20 cigarettes in a 30-minute period, 15 cigarettes in a 30-minute period, 10 cigarettes in a 30-minute period, 5 cigarettes in a 30-minute period. So you're decreasing your criterion of behavior, which criterion, you can use a change in criterion design to decrease the amount of cigarettes you're smoking in that period of time, which will likely decrease your behavior overall, and you're less likely to smoke an abundance of cigarettes, which are extremely harmful for your health in the long run. So as you can see, with each type of differential reinforcement, we are continuously pairing either extinction or some form of punishment with reinforcement no matter what. And for more information, more visuals, more videos, you can visit at allaboutthataba.com. Also, I will be posting weekly some videos on YouTube. Please join our YouTube and subscribe for more updates. All this information was brought to you by Cooper, Pass the Big ABA, and All About That ABA. Subscribe for more information.